transparent glass and creating shadows and reflections seems difficult to many painters. Yet in fact, the techniques involved are not complex at all. Hello, I'm Sherry Nelson, and today I'll share some really effective tips to help you create such realistic elements in this still life. When you've painted this, you'll agree, glass, reflections, and shadows are not so scary. Let's look first at the palette. I've put cobalt ciccative in several of my patties of paint, and I'll show you now how to put it in the rest. Ciccative helps the paint dry faster, overnight usually for the finished painting, and yet leaves the palette open and workable for many hours. Notice what a tiny freckle of a drop that I put next to each patty. Then I wipe the knife and mix the ciccative in. The advantage of using ciccative, of course, is it keeps you from waiting for days for your painting to dry, or in case like this still life, it keeps you from having to wait too long to do the final overlays of color in reflections in the glass. Notice how I scrape the paint back into a nice tight pile so that not so much surface area is exposed, lengthening the time it takes for the patty of paint to dry. Yet when I pull the paint out flat and dry into a loading zone, that's when it begins tacking up and helps me reduce the amount of paint that I carry on my brush. Now let's look at the painting for a minute. We're going to start with placing the shadows in the area inside the glass. I think the first mistake that most decorative painters make when they're painting transparent glass is they think the glass should be painted white. But glass isn't white, it's translucent, and you see the colors inside it. Colors from the stems, colors from the shadows, colors from the shadows of the leaves up here. That creates a lot of depth and a lot of color inside the glass. In fact, probably 90% of the total color in transparent glass is shadow, not highlight. And that's what we're going to start with. Before I go to the sample, one more thing. Notice here how I've hazed in also some accent color. In addition, the accent picking up reflections from adjacent flowers or other areas in the painting. So at the shadow stage, I place in strong shadows, leaf stems, and accent colors, and let those dry before I begin placing the very few but dramatic strong lights. Now on this sample piece, I'll start by taking raw umber plus sap green, which is a kind of a brownish green, and begin laying in the leaf stems. Now on the palette, I'm going to pull out my loading zones, which I mentioned before, which the ciccative will begin tacking up fairly rapidly. That helps me keep a minimum amount of paint on the brush. Pull out the loading zones and work between the two, one for the sap green, one for the raw umber. That gives me a mix of the two colors. Now I'm going to go to this surface area here. I'm holding the brush quite horizontal to the surface, and I'm just going to scruff this in. I'm going to work the left side of the leaf stems first, and then turn the piece one time to work the right side. That just keeps me from turning the piece around over and over and spending a lot of time at it. Now, probably most important at this stage is to remember you don't want a lot of paint. This is very flat and dry, and perhaps you can even hear the brush scruffing the paint in. Very, very dry, minimal amount, extended quite sparsely across the surface. Now it doesn't look real neat yet, but that's okay. We've got a ways to go here before we get this to be just exactly the way we want the base coat to look before we let it dry. So I'm still scruffing on sap green, raw umber, very dry, fairly neatly to the outer edge of the left side of the stem, and letting it just fade away on the right side, which I'll define and sharpen here in a minute when I turn the surface. The leaf stems are visible through the glass, but they're not fully visible. And that's one of the reasons that we want them to be pretty transparent, even at this early stage. Okay, now I'm going to turn the surface a bit and do the other side. And you can see that what I'll do is I'll come in and define the opposite side, and again scruff the paint out flat and dry. It works very easily, actually. Most important, though, probably to remember is to keep the brush flat to the surface. When you set the brush up on the chisel and use it that way, you often get too much definition in the surface. And when you're trying to lay the paint on scruffy, dry, and rather indistinct, it helps to have that brush horizontal. Okay, now I have most of the stems in now. And now we can take a look at the original painting again for a second and look at some other areas of color. Notice here, raw umber. This is raw umber and a little sap green, but mostly raw umber. Then again, here we use this purple madder alizarin with a little bit of raw umber. That's that pinkish haze. All of this inside the glass. So let's turn the piece again and start putting some strong raw umber shadowing in that lower left side. I'm going to put a bit of green in it, but this time more umber than any other color. Now the glass has a thickness to it, and the thickness prevents you from seeing as much shadowing inside as you think you might. For example, here on this edge you're seeing the thickness of the glass, the manufactured edge of the glass, heavier, and so what it does is it blocks out the shadow and looks more opaque. So in that area we don't carry the strong shadow to it as much. So here I'm filling in with the raw umber, coming up the left side to the edge of the glass, not the outer edge now, but the edge of where the glass begins to be opaque. Now I'm still going to need a little bit of color in that very outside edge, but it's going to be much drier and very, very sparse in comparison to what I just put on the inside, so that it just barely outlines the glass surface. Now, if I want to deepen this shadow just a bit, I can add some black from a black loading zone over into the raw umber. Now, I still want the raw umber to be the majority of color, but notice how the black helped deepen it. And I'm going to lay that in fairly heavily on that side. Another place for black and raw umber is up at the top here, where I want to deepen and strengthen a shadow area right under the rim of the glass. And I'm going to let this shadow pull down over and across the top of the stems. That helps set the stems back inside the glass instead of making them look like they're on the outside. Mostly raw umber, but with a bit of black if I like to have that extra strength or that extra darkness. Now, while I'm doing stronger shadows inside the glass, I'll probably want to haze a few fainter ones out to this outside edge here. I can pull it up, scruff it out. Notice how little paint is on the brush. That's the most important thing at this point. We don't want to get in too heavily and have too much paint to move. Now we're also going to lay in a little bit of scruffy shading along the bottom edge. And let's clean up this outside edge and bring the color all the way to the graphite line. Now speaking of graphite lines, sometimes when you put your pattern on, you don't get them quite even. Just because they're not even doesn't mean you have to follow them. Straighten up your graphite, clean it up, neaten it, make it more precise. If you've made an error in transfer, correct that error in the painting. Don't just follow it, mindlessly, because then the painting doesn't look accurate. We also need some of this color to lay a shadow area in the rim of the glass, like so. Inside this area, another opportunity to place shadow forms. This is a piece of the back side of the glass that you're seeing, heavily shadowed now by all the stems and the leaves. Now, one last thing to go inside the glass, as we mentioned before, is the purple madder alizarin shadowing. We can't put it on straight, it's a little bit too strong of a color. So I'll pick up raw umber and tone down and control the intensity of the PMA a bit, and then lay it on very, very hazily. Now I'm trying to use a light touch and even cutting across the stems in some areas with it. We can have a tiny bit over on this side as well, cutting across those stems some. Now let's define with black and raw umber. Actually, let's just use sap green and raw umber this time. The back side of the inner base of the glass, make that a little bit stronger too. Now, this is probably sufficient shadow for the moment inside the glass. I say for the moment because we have a couple of steps yet to go. We're going to soften it with the cheesecloth, and if as we soften it we remove too much paint, then what we may have to do is come back and retouch, add a little back in, just in case we've removed a bit too much. Now, before I start with the cheesecloth, let's look for a second at the painting again. Let's look at reflections. Reflections are nothing more than a mirror image of the object itself. So if you visualize this surface as a mirror, it's going to reflect exactly the same way on the surface as it does as the object itself looks like. However, usually the surface absorbs light, and therefore this reflected image generally has 1 or 2 values less light in the reflection than the glass itself. So that means that when I place the shadow forms in the reflected area, I'll try to place them a little darker, I'll leave a little bit more paint, and I won't add as much highlight at the end either. Now, since this is a mirror image, we're using the same colors, we're doing it the same way. Let's do it right now. Let's start laying in some of the reflected shadow forms as well. Back to the sap green and raw umber. I'm going to start right back in the same place and essentially do the same thing. Now sometimes I said usually reflections are a value darker, and that's true. Sometimes they're also a value or 2 or a percentage, let's say, less visible. So sometimes you can create realistic reflections by not making them as heavy. So there's various ways that you can go about it. For example, I can have just a bit of reflection here and still have it be effective, as long as it's a value darker than what I have, or what I did in the glass, let's say. Now, look at how I'm placing the reflection in between the stem and the leaf, laying a little bit of color here, and you see what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to match this. I'm trying to make it truly a mirror image. Okay, there's greenish on this side. Let's start with greenish down this direction and let it haze away just a little bit. So now I've reflected the strong dark here. I've made it a value darker with a little black. I'll probably want to sharpen this, define this here under this leaf, again with a bit more black in the mix, to get a little bit darker value in the reflected area. Now we have one last thing, and that's the PMA mix. If we have PMA in the glass, then it should appear in the reflection too. So let's haze a little bit down here. Now, that's essentially the basis or the starting point for transparent glass. First, you place all the shadow forms. If you're reflecting it, then you place the reflections as well. Now let's look at hazing it out. Look at the difference between the way this looks here, the sample I've just done, and the hazing in the finished piece. Look how soft and almost translucent that appears. Part of what makes it look realistic is we're now going to remove some of the paint with cheesecloth. I take a small bit of cotton cheesecloth, not the polyester stuff, and I'm going to first start rolling it around my fingertip. I'm going to first start by softening each individual leaf or flower stem. And I'll soften that away until I get just the right amount of fadiness or faded look that I want. Now, I can also increase the pressure when I get into the areas of PMA, the purple madder alizarin, soften those back. Look how suddenly the glass begins to take on shape and form, and also begins to have that hazy, translucent look that is really true of realistic glass. Glass is a manufactured object. It runs up and down. That's the shape, the form of it when it's made. And so that's the way I have to blend the glass itself up and down. In the base of the glass, I blend with a bit of the oval shape because the base itself is oval. Now, let's talk about blending reflected areas. Same way. Now, if you can't seem to get it to soften sufficiently, and you've still got a little bit of dirty color on the cheesecloth, just turn to a clean side and increase your pressure. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm looking to see if I'm getting just enough haze, not too much, not removing too much paint. Sometimes it's a tough call. You may have to set it back away from you a bit, look at it from a distance, decide if you've created just the right amount of shadowing within the glass before you're ready to go on. Now, that looks just about right to me. I think we've done the right amount in terms of shadow, shading, hazing, so forth. Now what you have to do is set this piece aside and let it dry before you go on to create the strong highlights. And I've done that on a second sample piece, so now we can go right on to the strongest lights in the glass. You see, this piece is done approximately the same way, and it's already dry to the touch. Now let's look back at the original for a minute and talk about what happens next to create this realistic look. Here, there's some faint hazing. Here, some stronger lights, even stronger. And here, the strongest of all, the catch light, the highest highlight. Now, the thing to remember when you're reflecting your transparent glass and getting these lights in is that underneath every light, no matter how strong it is, begins a low light. So I'm going to start with low lights in all areas and then gradually eliminate those areas to where I'm only putting highlights in just a couple of them. So let's start with low light. Let's look at the palette. I have a dirty brush with the raw umber and sap green, and I'm going to pull dirty brush plus white out. Now, that color would do sufficiently for a low light, but since there's so much green in the glass, I might even want my low light to have a bit more green in it. I can pick up a little sap, make a hazy, mossy, very faint off-white with a green cast. If I want to, I can dull that green with a teeny bit of the PMA, just a smidgen. There's some lovely low light choices there now to lay in all of these highlight areas as the bottom level, the lowest part of the pyramid of lights that I'm going to build. Now, the other thing important, first of all, that the low lights must be low, not white, and second of all, very little paint. You can see that we've put the majority of paint on here already. Now when I begin to build these low lights, there's hardly any addition at all. Now, one of the most important things to give the bottle dimension is that a portion of this low light haze should fall in front of the curve of the back of the bottom of the glass, and that makes it look like this piece is truly in front of the glass instead of stopping at this back line. So be sure you do that in at least one place. Notice my brush is flat and dry again, the same way that I applied the scruffy areas of leaf and stem color too. So there's some scruffy low lights. Now you can look at the original and you can see that there's low light coming down the right side. There's a little bit of low light present up here under what will be the strongest highlight. There's low light in the rim. Remember always that there's going to be low light under all other highlights. Even if those highlights are high or low, there's still low light present in those areas. Also remember that we're going to wipe off some of this light just like we buffed down some of the shadow areas in the glass. And so sometimes I actually put perhaps a little bit more than I need, just because I want to have enough to have some left after I soften it down and buff it down. Some low light here. Now, if we put low light in the glass, we have to put low light in the reflection. And so we're going to do that too. Scruffing here. Now let's look down at our mirror image. If I have light here, it has to be here. If I have scruffy low light there, it must follow through in the reflected area. A little low light on the right has to appear in the reflection too. Now, generally I put on my low lights just as you've seen me doing here, and then I buff those out and then come back and build to the final lights with lighter values. So let's do that. I think that's sufficient for the low lights. I think you can begin to see the glass taking form and shape now. Back to the cheesecloth. This time I want to get a clean side and I want to soften the low lights just like we did the other colors. They don't take as much work and you don't need to move as much paint. Just smooth it out a little bit. You're really just using your cheesecloth for blending. Now we'll set that aside, and now let's look at the palette again. The next highlight has to be whiter. I'm going to pull some over into a cleaner white loading zone, and I'm going to work out of this area rather than the low, dirty highlight area. Now sometimes I add a bit of warm color, raw sienna or cad yellow pale, just a speck of it, to my highlight color, because warm lights come forward to the eye, even more than cool lights. So here I've got just a smidgen on the corner of the brush, and I'll pull it into that loading zone, and it makes what appears to be quite a yellowish area. But watch what happens. When I lay this on the surface of the glass, it's barely visible as yellow, if at all. Now, I've got to think about where I want what I would call secondary lights. We've put on the bottom level of light. Now I want to think about a little bit of spark, but not the strongest lights quite yet. So one there, perhaps a bit under where the strongest highlight's going to fall. A little under this haze here, perhaps. And you see, not too much more than that. Maybe a little bit of a build-up here. There. Perhaps a bit just at the bottom, a line or two. A catch light, really. And here, a bit of a line there. Break it up some, and some under where the strongest lights will fall there. Now, probably, if I have done my low lights correctly, I won't need to add any secondary lights in the reflected areas. Didn't we say reflection should be a value darker? And so if we're going to do that, we don't want to reflect high highlights in our reflected area. So my reflections, for the most part, are probably finished. Now I'm going to take the cheesecloth and soften. Just a little bit, not much. This prepares our glass now for the strongest final highlight. See, that's just a buffing, really. Very little to it. Now, I usually move to a smaller brush for the final highlights because I want very good control, and I just want to place spark lights, not the duller lights of the secondary highlights. So, a little bit of a spark there. Tap it in. I may never touch that one again now. Over on this side, a stronger light, very little, hardly touched on, left alone. I may want to build this a bit, and this one I may end up blending, but it won't be much. It'll just be to leave a haze there. Then there's strong catch lights up on the neck of the bottle. Here in the highlight area, a little messy, irregular light that follows the construction of the rim. And then finally, let's do this really interesting catch light on the side. Falls right about here, breaks right at the neck. Whoops, one thing. Let's go back up 1 second. I'm going to go back to the other brush. I'm going to pick up a low light. Almost forgot this. And let's lay in this little bit of haze to indicate a liquid level in the bottle. I'm going to buff that out just a smidgen with the brush. Now notice that the liquid level doesn't go all the way to the edge. That's because the edge of the glass is more opaque because it's thicker there. Now I may build this a little bit lighter here in the center part, but let it fade away to the edges. Now I can soften that just a bit if I need to. But now let's go back and place the strong lights. You can see why I had to do the liquid level first, because I want to place these strong lights on top of it, again to push back what's in the glass and bring the outside of the glass forward to the eye of the viewer. Now let's make a little bit of a square. Let's make a triangle below it, and perhaps a little ragged shape or triangle above it, like so. Now, those lights I have to decide about blending on. Sometimes on the strong lights I push them into the surface like that with the cheesecloth. On this light we said we were going to blend it just a smidgen, just to soften it back into the bottle. Now I think you can see that we've created very nice, realistic glass, really with very little effort. And the most important thing to remember is that you always want to create more shadow than you do light. That's what makes the glass look realistic. Now, let's talk about a couple of other things. I'm going to paint some lily petals for you and some of the elements so that you feel confident about doing the painting. And then we want to do shadows also. Now, let's look at the lilies closely for a minute. One of the things that makes them so striking and so beautiful is that the strong light really adds a sheen to the petal and makes the petal look as though it's turned or rolled. And that's one of the things we want to accomplish. These lilies are actually very easy, but they do take a little bit of doing. You have to put the color on just so in order to get that rolled look in the petal. Now, let's start with this petal in front. It's a large one. It'll be easy to understand and easy to see. I'm going to put a little bit of green at the very base of the petal. Most flowers have some greenish in them. Now, if I put sap green straight, it would be too strong, too intense. So I'm going to take a little of the red, which is the complement of the sap green, and I'm going to dull the green down with the red paint. That gives me a dull, controlled green, a green that I can lay into this flower center without having problems controlling it. As soon as you get it on your surface, you can decide if it's green enough or if you got too much of the red in. In this case, I think I'll add just a bit more of the pure green. Now, notice how I am using the chisel edge of the brush to walk that color out and break it into little irregular points. That's so that I can interlock the next color into it like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Very important, because if you meet your colors in a hard line like this, then you have to blend to get rid of that line, and it really makes it hard. But if you meet your colors in an irregular line, then they just meld together perfectly and realistically. Now the next color, look at this beautiful yellow here. It's a deep, rich yellow made with the cad yellow pale and a little bit of the cad scarlet. So I'll pick up that mix next. Now surprisingly, this mix looks quite orange on the palette and very yellow on the surface. And so you may have to make it a bit oranger here than you think you would to get the right color. See, look how yellow it looks on this surface, and yet how orange against the palette color. Now, I'm using the brush, wiggle it around, get that chisel edge to work, and connect it with the green. Make it work together, make it connect, interlock, just like that jigsaw puzzle piece. Okay, now the remainder of the petal we're going to base with a mixture of PMA. I'm going to pull it out in a fresh loading zone. Raw sienna to cut the intensity of it. Purple madder alizarin is a purple, and the complement of purple is yellow, which raw sienna is, so I can control the intensity of my purple quite easily with raw sienna. And then I'm going to add white. Now, because I'm mixing on a white palette, it's very difficult to properly evaluate both intensities and values. So what I do is I make a little patch of color like that, and I test it on my surface. And then I look at the original, I think about the intensity of it, I think about, whether I believe I have that color cut to the proper intensity, and in this case, I think you can see that this pink is a little more raw, a little more pink than the pink of the original painting. And so I'm going to control that pinkness by adding a bit more raw sienna. In other words, I'm going to warm it up and cut the intensity of it. Now look at the difference in that pink. You can see very easily that this is a warmer pink and this a cooler one. If I go over the original base coat there with just a little bit of the new color, I can control it and have just a perfect base coat. Now I'm going to chisel edge this color into the yellow and finish blocking in the rest of the petal. It takes a little bit of time, and I've stayed with a 2, although I think I'm going to pick up a 4. This petal is large enough to warrant a slightly larger brush, and it'll speed up my base coating process just a little bit. Notice how I drag the brush, fuzz it, rough it on the surface, break up the color, extend it as far as I can extend it, because I want the color to just be as sparse as possible. It's the same old situation. If you're going to paint with oil paints and you want your detail color to adhere beautifully to the surface and to really show up nicely, you can't have a heavy base coat on there. Now you can see that I have got the base coat for the entire petal. I've already done my blending between my yellow and between the yellow and the green, between the pink and the yellow and the green mix. And now we're ready to place those first highlights that are going to make this petal roll over instead of just lay there flat. So now let's go to strong white highlighting. I'm going to lay it in very firm. Look at the brush. I have it flat to the ferrule. I'm scruffing the paint on, breaking up the edges of it, and putting it on with pressure. Now look at the bottom of the brush. The color that you see there is the color that was underneath the petal, underneath the highlight. And so what I've done is I've put on the highlight color and removed the base coat color. And that gives me an opportunity to blend with less risk of muddy colors. Now watch. I've backed the brush up on the handle, and I'm going to skizzle the color together, softening the pink into the light right on the line where the colors meet. Now, this is a little tricky. The light is on the inner side, this side of the brush that's toward me. If I move the brush over here, I've now moved the light to the outer side of the brush and the dirty base coat color to the inner side. So if I want to make this blend more effective, I turn the piece. Now the light is still to the inner side of the brush, and I have better control over it. Easy, but sometimes the kind of thing you don't think much about. Okay, now there's the first highlight. What we need to do now is build it more strongly one more time. I'm wiping the brush dry and picking up clean, sharp light once more. Now we're going to go back, very dry paint off the palette, and we're going to go back, we're going to do exactly the same thing again. Watch. down to the ferrule, pressure, break it up, make that edge ragged and uneven. Do it again on the other side. Down to the ferrule, lots of pressure, ragged, uneven. Again, the color on the bottom of the brush is the color that was underneath the highlight. So what that does is it gives me a single layer of paint so I don't lose control of it and don't get my colors muddied. Dry the brush. Let's blend right on the line where the colors join. Notice I'm still using the same chisel edge motion. And this would be a good time to talk about growth direction a bit. I'm blending this way because the general growth direction of the petal moves in this direction. And so what I do is I hold the chisel edge of the brush parallel to the growth direction. And what that enables me to do is create a slight surface texture that indicates the growth direction of the petal. So I've blended this side. The light is to the inner side of the brush, and so now I have to turn the surface again in order for the light to remain toward the light side, and then blend this half. Now, each time, since you're concerned about growth direction, each time you change position on the petal, you have to re-evaluate which way your growth direction is going. Here it's changed, it's rolling with the curve. We're wanting to roll this petal over, and so I'm making this brush stay with the growth direction, parallel with the growth direction, all the way along as I follow the shape of the petal. Now, whether I highlight it again or not is a choice that I really can't make at this time. I have 5 petals on this flower, and until I have all 5 painted, sometimes it's difficult to decide whether or not you want more highlight in that front petal or not. Let's look at the original a second. You see, I need to paint all 5 of these petals, place all of these light areas, and then decide if I want any of these front areas to be stronger light yet. But we can put some shading color, which will give us better contrast with the light and help us better evaluate the shape and form of the petal we've done. Now for shading color, I'm going to move to the 2, a little smaller brush. And I'm going to go back to that PMA mix we made earlier, purple madder alizarin and a little raw umber. Could even have a little of the raw sienna in it. And in a couple of the turned areas on the petal, I'm going to lay a little bit of the PMA mix to begin to deepen and roll those areas back away from the eye. Now, once it's on, and notice that as I placed it, I broke the edge a little by ragging it out with the chisel of the brush. That's so that it's easier for me to get a good blend. Now, watch what happens here. I'm going to walk this color out, break up the edge, lay the chisel on the line where the colors join, keep the chisel parallel to the growth direction. And what that accomplishes is it gives me the opportunity to create surface texture in the petal. A nice rolled edge where the dark rolls away from the eye, and still keep the petal moving in the proper direction. Now I'm going to go back to the 4 now that I have my shading blended, and I'm going to put in a center vein line, a division line that runs from the base of the petal down to the tip. I'm going to use a nice clean highlight color to do that. Now on the lily, oftentimes the tip of the petal is an area where this light center shaft line or center vein line fades away and then widens out. Now watch how I'm widening that a little bit so that it looks as though the petal is splitting a little bit at the tip. Okay, now I think you can see that, and that center vein line also helps the petal roll and move just like it should. Now, I could do more petals, but before I take time to do that, let's make sure that we can get some of these other areas in here too. Let's talk about the stamens real quickly. I'm going to use a small brush and pick up raw sienna. I wouldn't do the stamens, of course, normally until every single petal is painted, but I want you to be able to see them so that you'll have an idea of how to handle it. There's the base of the stamen stem with raw sienna. Now I'm going to add Cad Yellow Deep to that raw sienna and make a more yellowish mix and finish filling in the stem. Now I'm going to take the same mix and add white to it and go back and highlight on the round outermost part of that stem. Now sometimes you can't get that to hold very well, and so I tap it on rather than pull it on. Sometimes with a chisel, if you slide that chisel down with a little bit of pressure, it does nothing more than scrape off the paint. And so in order to combat that problem, I simply walk the chisel down, tapping it as I go, and that lays on the paint and leaves it nice and sharp. Now let's look at the tip. The tip has to be done with the round brush. I'm going to use the little round, first basing the tip with Cad Scarlet, perhaps a little bit of the yellow. It's a ragged, little flat-shaped tip, not a lot of neat edge work to it. It can be a little fuzzy, actually. Notice I even made a little point and kind of curved it some. Now within that tip, we're going to shade a little bit by adding sap green to this Cad Scarlet to make it more dull and darker. And I'm just going to tap that sap green mix in there. A tiny, tiny detail, but the kind of thing that makes your still life look really pretty and realistic. Now, let's do a leaf too while we have a minute. And we'll talk about that. Then we're going to go on to doing the last of our shadows and reflections. Now, the leaf colors, quite simple combinations, black and sap green again, some of the greens that we used in the bottle area. And I'm going to lay those in within a dark area, usually central or back in the leaf. And I use very small amounts of paint and scruff it quite dry. In fact, there's hardly a time that I paint when my paint isn't dry. And that's because with oils, your paint is always wet on the surface. You never have the opportunity to work with a dry paint in terms of it being dry to the touch. And so you always have to be cautious about the way you handle your color and make sure that you have control over it. Now this leaf rolls over, forms a shadow underneath here, and goes down into the little glass bottle. I'll probably increase the amount of black in the mixture in order to get that to tuck down in there nicely and to make it look like it's really a bit further from the eye than the forepart of the leaf that's sticking out. Now, the light value is sap green, and I'm going to pull it out here in a separate loading zone. Sap green dulled down with raw sienna, and then with a bit of white added to lighten the value. Notice that that makes a pretty mossy green, quite soft, very nice color, not too attention-getting, which is of course exactly what you want for a leaf area, which is certainly not the focal point in the painting. I'm going to pull this color up and around this curve to bring the leading edge of this leaf back in front of that shadow area. I'll have to do the edge on the side toward me at another point, because to do it at this point just makes it fuzz and not be very neat. And I'll finish filling the tip. Notice how I scruff the paint, always trying to extend it as far as possible so that I have control over the dryness of it. Very, very important. Now let's blend the colors together. Chisel edge again. I'm thinking about growth direction of the leaf, which is with the length of the leaf. So let's run the chisel this way, down the length of the leaf to soften between the values in the direction of the growth. I'll add a little growth direction here in the darkest area and blend that together too. Now let's go back to the light value. If I simply add more white to it, I can make an even lighter value, which will give me a pleasing highlight for the leaf. Let's pick some neat places to put it. Here on this leading edge, draws a little bit of attention there. The tip would usually be a little bit lighter. We might even want to add just a smidgen of light along this edge to further bring it forward and to give it a little bit more dimension. Dry the brush, hold it flat to the surface, blend with the chisel, blend with the growth. Same concepts applied now to the leaf as well as the petals. Now, the last thing for the leaf, we have to do a center vein, just like we had to do a center vein in the lily petal. So let's turn it around and let me come with the same highlight value. And I'm going to start it up here at the top where it disappears out of view as the leaf rolls over. And I'm going to slide it down the length of the leaf and let it fade toward the tip. Now, you may be able to see a bit of the center vein in there. We can add that too, but let it blend into the dark and be a little bit darker of value, since this part is back in and under the shadow of the leaf. Now, while we have leaf colors on the brush, let's do a bud. We're going to go up here to the top and pick this nice bud here that's in the open. And let's go right back to the dark area color of the leaf once again. Black plus sap green. I'll fuzz it along the edges, break up the inner edge where the dark's going to pretty soon meet my light value. Notice how I'm breaking up all those inner edges. That's that same concept again, that I want those colors to interlock like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, not lay next to each other in a hard line, which then makes our blending and value gradation much more difficult. Now, while we're talking about leaves, buds, we might as well talk about stems too. Here on the stem, let's outline it, so to speak, with the dark value. On the calyx, the bud cup here, a little bit of outline also of the dark value. Okay, so now we have dark green on the outer edge of all three of those areas. Let's wipe the brush dry and go right back to my light green value. This was, remember, raw sienna, sap, and white. Now we're going to fill in the rest of the bud and the rest of the stem and calyx with the same mix. Now, when I fill in these two smaller areas, I usually immediately dry the brush and then come back and tap with the chisel edge right on the line where the dark meets the light. That just helps give me a value change there and begin the process of making this stem round and roll. Now, on the bud itself, I'm going to have to blend with the chisel because the chisel is parallel to the growth direction, the natural movement and growth of this bud area. Okay, so now there's the basics for it. Now, let's highlight. No, let's not. Let's do accent color first. Let's go back to the PMA mix. PMA, raw sienna. Right here at the tip of the bud, there's a split. The bud is opening, right? And it's beginning to allow some of the flower to show. Let's create this split with the PMA. While we've got the PMA in there, let's add a few subtle vein lines. Sometimes the lily buds carry the lily color in the veins. So let's lay a few in. Now we're ready for highlighting. I'll wipe the brush thoroughly because I had the PMA in it. I'll pick up some white and come over here into my light value green and perhaps bring a little more of that white into it. So it's a value lighter, at least, perhaps 2 values lighter than the light green value that we placed here. Now, pulling across, I'm going to lay little sections, little elongated lines or bands of lighter green. pulling across. Now, ideally, I want the lightest sections to be those that are right in front, and the darker sections, the darker highlights, to fade away as I go around the edge of the bud. That just helps increase the amount of roundness that I'm able to create. So over here, where I'm working now, I would like this value not to be as light as this one here. Now, while I've got the light value on the brush, let's go back and do stem too, and calyx. I'll touch a little in the middle, soften the edges. Now that rounds very nicely toward the eye. Now, all of these bud areas are done pretty much the same, but you can put differing amounts of the greens and the PMA in each one. Look at the original for a minute. You can see that in some of the topmost buds there's less distinction, less strong color. In the bottom buds, a little bit more detail. And that just helps the piece hang together a bit better, look more realistic, because all the buds are not going to be the same. And we use the PMA in the bud. Let's go back to the leaf now for just a moment, and I can show you that we can take some of that PMA and drag it into the leaf for a little accent, and also for another opportunity to tie the leaf and the bud, the lily colors, and the colors in the glass all together in a nice uniform way. What we really want is we want to unify the painting, make it look like it's all the parts belong together. And color, of course, is the best way to do that. Now, in the last few minutes that we have, let's talk about shadows and reflections down here at the bottom once again. We now have a lily petal to reflect. Remember I said reflections are a mirror image of the object that's reflecting it. So I want to take the pink mix and I want to haze and scruff a little bit of pink down here into this area. Pull it around here, bring it up to actually touch the lily petal, and scruff it out with the dry brush. Now, if I want to really be picky, I can take a little stronger PMA, increase the value there in the reflection, however I want to handle it. But I probably won't add much light to it. This petal here, even though we don't have it painted, it would get the same kind of scruffy, dry, pink reflection. One of the best ways to understand what your goals are in a still life painting is to set up the still life, take a photo of it, and study what happens with the reflections, the lights, the shadows, so that you really understand what they ought to look like. You can't really make it up. Now, when I get this color fuzzed in, and we might say also, here's a leaf area, I would fuzz in that leaf color too, just the same as I did the petal color. Let's fuzz a little dry leaf color in so that it looks as though we're reflecting this leaf down into the surface as well. Fuzz it, break it, make the shape a mirror image. Okay, now back to the cheesecloth. We'll want to blend and soften this into the surface, just like we did the reflections of the glass itself. Pulling with the cheesecloth, I may want to get rid of almost all of it. You know, I may not want very much at all to stay in the surface, just enough to give you the idea that the reflections are there, that they're doing their job of making this more dimensional and showing off the objects that are reflecting them. Always turn to a clean side of the cheesecloth if you feel that you're carrying too much paint or that you're getting the reflection outside of the line of the reflection itself. Now we need to talk about shadows for a minute. Somehow shadows always seem to baffle painters almost more than anything else. Let's look at the original a second and see what we do with them. The shadows are cast by the objects which are blocking the light. So that means that these petals are casting a shadow here. The body of this flower is casting the shadow here. This bottle is casting this shadow here. In other words, it's an interruption. And so what we do is we just fuzz on a little color and then wipe it dry. Watch, let's do it with raw umber. Very, very small amount of paint. Shadow should have 3 values. I'm going to lay the strongest value up against the object which is casting the shadow. I'll do the same here. I wish all these objects were painted, but you'll be able to see the completed original in your instructional materials, and I don't think you'll find it confusing at all. Now, when you work on this piece and you're laying shadows in, I want you to be sure and do the reflections first, because the reflections have to be shadowed over and on top of them, not underneath. In other words, you don't do the shadows and then the reflections. You do the reflections and then the shadows. Now notice how the shadows now look on top of the reflections, which is exactly where they fall. Now, if the shadow color is not quite dark enough, and shadows need to be quite dark next to the object which is casting them, if they're not quite dark enough, you can always add a bit of black to get a little bit more depth, a little bit more strength. I'd shadow this out here, lay it right up next to the finished object, come right across the reflection as though it wasn't even there. And see, look at how that makes the shadow really appear on top. That's why you have to paint the reflections first, and why it's a good idea if the reflected glass areas are dry before you attempt to do the shadows. I can lay a little bit of shadow up in there. I can lay a little bit next to this petal. Many areas where you can put some very small amounts of very softly defined shadows and make it more effective. And now the same thing that we did with the reflections. We want to come back in and soften the shadows. We do want them, however, to have a value change. We can't have the shadow all the same value. I want it darker next to the object which is casting it. So therefore, I'm not going to wipe dry as much of the shadow as I did the reflection. Let's watch. I'm going to start at the edge, and I'm just going to do the edge of the shadow with the cheesecloth, trying to let it look as though the shadow is falling darker and deeper up next to the object which is casting it. Now you can see how those shadows are beginning to give depth and dimension to the object. Now here I'm going to be very careful because I don't want to scruff out my reflection totally as I do the shadows, but I do want to touch into it just a little bit. I think that just about wraps it up. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, and I hope I proved to you that glass and reflections are not difficult.